स्थिर रहो मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ चेतना। स्थिर रहो मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ चेतना। तू बार बार नाम चल, तू बार बार नाम चल, तू बार बार नाम चल, तू बार बार नाम चल। तुझे रहना है स्थिर अचल, तुझे रहना है स्थिर अचल। तू सत्य पे ध्यान धर, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ चेतना। स्थिर रहो मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ चेतना। समत्व भाव मन में ला, माही हो तेरा पता। समत्व भाव मन में ला, माही हो तेरा पता। जुड़ तू माँ के प्रेम से, जुड़ तू माँ के प्रेम से। इस प्रेम में पा पूर्णता, इस प्रेम में पा पूर्णता। स्थिर रहो मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना। तू बार बार नाम चल, तू बार बार नाम चल। तुझे रहना है स्थिर अचल, तू सत्य पे ध्यान धर, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ मेरी चेतना, ओ चेतना।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. This devotional song, Sthir Raho Meri Chetana, about stabilizing the mind, the emotional part of the being, which is so volatile. And the Gita says, Samatvam Yoga Uchyate. That is equality, roughly the same as equanimity, is what is called yoga. While staying stable, while keeping the mind stable can be a way of progressing on the path of yoga, even more important is the equanimity that is achieved as a product, as a consequence of walking the path of yoga. Because the deeper awareness of the truth, that is the comprehensive truth, the all-encompassing truth, that awareness itself gives us that larger picture, which makes everything that normally makes us upset appear trivial. And that is what gives stability to this volatile part of the being, the vital or the emotional part of the being. And therefore, the devotional song says, Satya pe dhyanadhar. That is, focus on the truth, concentrate on the truth, truth with a capital T, that comprehensive truth, based on the deeper truths of existence, which expands the awareness, takes it higher, makes it wider, and the result is that everything appears only a small thing, a trivial thing. And not only that, there is also a positive element added to it, everything that happens also uh, becomes an opportunity for further spiritual growth. It becomes a means to progress further on the path. So it's not just the type of philosophical equanimity which is achieved, which is good, but that sort of just makes us somewhat immune to the ups and downs of life. It makes us immune to the emotional upheavals. Here, it is not just that, it is acceptance of everything that happens with equal delight. And that's why it is better called equality, which is what Sri Aurobindo has called it. But then equality, can mean many other things. So sometimes it is misinterpreted uh, in this context. In this context, equality means responding to all the ups and downs of life with equal delight, equally happily. And how can we be equally happy no matter what is happening? If we can see something positive in it. And what is positive in it? That everything that happens in life, including things which appear completely negative, in which nothing positive can be seen at the rational level, even these are an opportunity for spiritual growth. So at least one positive feature is there in everything, including the most unpleasant and traumatic events that we may experience in life. And that is what makes this equality or samatva uh, different from just philosophical equanimity. With this, we go to today's topic, and that is the endocrines. We'll have 3 sessions on the endocrines. Today is our first session, and so we'll focus on the general principles. Hormones are something which have become a common term. Uh, Everybody's talking about the hormones. It is my hormones because of which perhaps I'm putting on weight, and so on and so forth. Now, the source of the hormones are the endocrine glands in the body, and they are not just about putting on weight, but they have so many functions. In fact, what we can say is that it is one of the major regulatory systems of the body, because the systems that we have seen so far contribute in some way to providing the optimal conditions, the right conditions for the cells to function. The right conditions are that the fluid, the small bit of fluid that surrounds these cells, should have enough of oxygen and nutrients, and should be at the right temperature, should have the right amount of saltiness, right amount of acid or alkali, and the waste products should not accumulate in this fluid. While the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and the gastrointestinal system or the kidneys make some very obvious contributions to maintaining this environment of the cells constant. What is also important is that the activities of these organs are regulated or coordinated, because they can't just go on functioning at an even pace. The activity needs to be stepped up or stepped down depending upon the requirements of the body, which keep fluctuating. For example, we may be exposed to high temperature or low temperature in the environment, or after eating a meal, the blood is flooded with glucose. If we are, if you've not taken meal for half a day, then the blood glucose is going down and the body needs to respond. When we take exercise, we are consuming more oxygen, producing more carbon dioxide. And when that happens, how does the heart know that now the person is exercising and therefore the muscles need more oxygen? They are producing more carbon dioxide, which needs to be got rid of. And to meet these requirements, the activity of the heart should go up, the activity of the respiratory system should go up. And when the exercise is over, when it has been terminated, then the activity should come down to the resting level. Both are important. And this type of a coordination, that is telling the heart what to do and telling the lungs what to do, is accomplished by the coordinating system of the body. And the major coordinating systems are the endocrine system and the nervous system. We shall take up nervous system towards the end of this course, but this session and the next two will focus on the endocrines. So with that introduction, let's go to the PowerPoint. Before we go further, once again, this course and all the activities of the YES project are a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th year of India's independence. The anatomical pictures, the realistic looking pictures, have been taken from Tortora and Grabowski's Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. This is a picture that shows many of the endocrine glands of the body, the hypothalamus, which is a part of the brain, the pineal, the pituitary, the thyroid, the thymus, the heart, the stomach, and of course also the intestines, the kidneys, and the small intestine, the pancreas, the adrenals, the liver, the lungs, and the skin. Now, this is a rather comprehensive view. We will not be talking about all of these as endocrine glands, but as you can see that it seems that just about every part of the body also has some cells which produce chemicals which can qualify as hormones. Now, these are the major endocrine glands which we shall focus a little more on, and that is the pituitary, which is at the base of the brain, and the thyroid, which is in the neck in front of the trachea, and on the back side of this are the parathyroid glands, and here is the pancreas nestled in this loop of the C-shaped loop of the small intestine called the duodenum, and then these adrenals sitting on top of the kidneys, and in women the ovaries, and in men the testes. These we shall take up separately when we come to the reproductive system. Now, what are the characteristics of these endocrine glands which produce the hormones? They are ductless glands, which means they do not have a tube that conveys their secretion to the place where it has to go. For example, we saw that in case of the digestive system, the pancreatic juice is poured through a tube into the small intestine. Bile also travels through a tube to reach the small intestine. Now, these tubes are called ducts. Endocrine glands do not have any ducts. And they, of course, produce hormones. But then how are these hormones conveyed to the place where they have to go? And they are poured directly into the bloodstream. Just as like every other part of the body, the endocrines also have a blood supply. And while the blood is passing through the endocrines, while the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide is taking place, along with that, if something has been produced by the endocrine glands, that can also be transferred to the blood, and then it will travel all over the body. So the hormones travel all over the body because they are released directly into the bloodstream. Now, here is a comparison of the endocrine system and the nervous system. This is based on rather sort of classical or traditional concepts, which are by and large true, but then gradually the boundary between the endocrines and the nervous system, and to some extent also the immune system, is getting blurred. But for sake of clarity and simplicity, let's start with this. The endocrine glands produce the hormones, whereas the nervous system produces neurotransmitters. The nerve cells, the cells of the nervous system, which we call neurons, they produce neurotransmitters. The hormones are poured directly into the bloodstream, whereas the neurotransmitters produced by a neuron are released at the end of the neuron, one end of the neuron, which in turn impinges on another neuron. And therefore, the neurotransmitters produced by a neuron reach the beginning, you can say, of the next neuron. What is released at the end of one, in the small space between two neurons, that then reaches the beginning of the next neuron to continue the chain of the messages which are being transmitted. On the other hand, the hormones are transmitted, poured directly into the blood, and therefore they reach all over the body. And because they reach all over the body, their actions could be widespread. And these actions are slow. They take time to become perceptible. But once they start, they are relatively long-lasting. Whereas in the case of the nervous system, the action is local, more specific. Wherever this chain of neuron ends and finally releases its neurotransmitters at a muscle, and in a muscle or in a gland. So if they are released into a muscle, the muscle may contract. If the neurotransmitter is released in a gland, the gland may secrete more of its secretions. So the uh, action is local. Wherever this chain ends, carrying a message about contraction or stepping up or stepping down the activity of a gland. So the action is local. It is fast because once the neurotransmitter has been released, very soon the action begins. The muscle contracts or the gland starts secreting more or less, and the action is short lasting. When this chain has been switched off, the action comes to an end. So now you can see that the hormones are being poured directly into the blood, and therefore they reach all over the body. But that doesn't mean that they have an action all over the body. Hormones travel to all parts of the body, but do not act everywhere. For example, you uh, send a WhatsApp message or an email, it enters the cyberspace and it can go anywhere, but all the same, it carries an address label, which sort of makes it a message which is being thrown into a wide area, but then it also carries a label uh, which has an address. So, and you can say, if not a very specific label, at least to whom it may concern. And the concerned person to whom it is addressed somehow knows to identify. So, through a cooperation between the hormone and the place where it actually has to work, the hormone ends up acting at the specific sites, those places in the body where it is supposed to work. And the specificity is achieved through receptors for the hormone. So the target organs for the hormone, that is the place where the hormone will actually have an effect, although it is traveling everywhere, these places where it will have an effect are the target organs. And these target organs have receptors for the hormone, which means that there is some sort of an identification. The hormone and the receptors in the target organ, they can identify each other, and therefore the hormone knows that this is the place where I have to work. These hormone receptors are specific to the hormone target organ combination. And once the hormone reaches the right place, the hormone and its receptors in the target organ fit into each other like a lock and key. Now, this is something which now you have become very familiar with, that this is based on the shape of the molecules. And this is what happens at many other places, say between the enzyme and the substrate. They fit into each other like a lock and key, the enzyme and the substance on which the enzyme acts, for example, digestive enzymes. So they fit into each other like a lock and key. Then we saw also the antigen and the antibody, that is the antigen on the surface of, say, a germ, and the antibody which has been produced in response to this germ. This antigen and antibody also have a lock and key relationship. They can fit into each other. So similar complementary shape exists also in case of the hormones and the receptors for those hormones. For each hormone, there are specific receptors in the target organs into which they can fit like a lock and a key. The receptors may be located on the surface of the cell, or sometimes they are located inside the cell. Both types of receptors exist, but the end result is similar. The hormone acts only at those places where the receptors exist. And once the hormone has got bound to the receptor, the effect may be on some chemical reactions going on in the cell. The rate of these reactions may increase or decrease, and thereby the activity of this part of the body may be stepped up or stepped down, or the action may not be directly on chemical reactions, but on gene expression. That is, the genes of these cells of the target organs may be affected in such a way that the expression of some genes may be increased or decreased, may be stepped up or stepped down. And since the genes control what the proteins that the cell makes, and the proteins in turn determine the way this cell functions, through modulation of the gene expression, the hormones can modulate the activity of the target organ. So thereby, the receptors, they localize the action of the hormone to specific organs because the receptors for the hormone exist only in the target organs. And one can say, in other words, that the hormones modulate the sensitivity of the body to the hormone. And how does that happen? That happens because the sensitivity is regulated, the sensitivity to the hormone is regulated because not only the receptors exist, the receptors can be upregulated or downregulated, which means the number of receptors can increase or decrease. The number of receptors in the target organ, if it increases, that would be upregulation. And now, because the number of receptors has increased, the hormone level remaining the same, the action of the hormone on the target organ is more because now the number of receptors is increased. And on the other hand, if the receptors are down-regulated, their number goes down, the level of the hormone remaining the same, now the activity, the effect of the hormone on the target organ is less, which means that the organ has become less sensitive to the hormone. Now you can understand, a bit about why we say that in a person who has put on weight, there is insulin resistance. The same level of insulin, which is quite adequate for a healthy person, becomes ineffective in the person who has put on weight because the person has become less sensitive to insulin. The person has insulin resistance. The person is offering some resistance to insulin. And one mechanism by which this resistance is offered or sensitivity becomes less is the down regulation of the receptors. So you can see that there are wheels within wheels. The hormones are a part of the regulatory system. And in turn, so it means that the activity of the levels of the hormones can go up and down depending upon the requirements of the body. Then further, how effective the hormone will be, that is being regulated also by the target organ by increasing its sensitivity or decreasing its sensitivity to the hormone. And that is because the hormone receptor combination is necessary for the hormone to act. And the receptors can be either upregulated or downregulated. The number of these receptors can increase or decrease. So you can see that there's a regulation at many levels, and that's what makes the regulation more effective as well as complex. Now, how are the hormone levels themselves regulated? For a large number of hormones, the change starts with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a tiny part of the brain at the base of the brain, but one of the most important parts of the brain, and therefore we'll keep talking about Mr. Hypothalamus repeatedly from now probably till we reach the end of the course now. So hypothalamus is that tiny little organ, tiny little part of the brain, which is extremely important as a part of the endocrine system, also as a part of the nervous system, and one can say also as a part of the immune system. Because the boundary between these three is, as I said, gradually getting blurred. Because it's a part of the brain that is affecting the pituitary, which is a classical endocrine organ. And further, the hypothalamic activity itself is affected by thoughts and feelings. And therefore, thoughts and feelings can affect this entire chain from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to the target endocrine gland. And many of the substances produced in the hypothalamus and some other parts of the brain are very similar to very similar to some hormones. And many of the substances produced in the immune system, or the substances to which the immune system is sensitive, are those which are produced in the nervous system or by the endocrine system, and therefore the boundary is getting blurred. Something like, these are communication networks basically, because all regulation requires communication. That is, if there's a change taking place in the body right now, or a change is anticipated, then this should be communicated to the regulating agency so that it can collect the inputs from all those areas of the body which are relevant. And then, based on this entire input, based on the integration of this entire input, the regulatory organ can come to a decision about what should be done in the body and at which all places, and then send a message to those places which need to step up there, step down their activity, so that the activity is commensurate with the requirements of the body. So communication from the place where the change is taking place to the regulatory organ, and from the regulatory system to the target organs where a change of activity or a modulation of activity is required. So this is communication. So these communication systems have to work together, and therefore it's not surprising that as more and more has been discovered about these systems, we are finding that in fact the boundary is blurred. It's something like, there was a time when a TV was a TV and a phone was a phone. The TV did what the TV could do, and you had to have two instruments, one to work as your telephone and one to work as a TV. Now we find that the boundary between the not only between the TV and the phone, but also between the TV, phone, and the computer, and many other things has disappeared. In fact, the postal system has also merged with it, and more or less the postal system has become obsolete. The fax machines have become obsolete. Everything that was done with these individual instruments, like the phone and the computer and the TV and the fax machine, can be done by one single instrument. And that's why it's called smart. So the boundary has got blurred. In the same way, in the body also we find, in fact, the boundary is not watertight, but all the same, for convenience, it's easy to sort of simplify things and talk in terms of them separately. Now, how does this chain work? Again, to generalize, sort of for simplicity, the hypothalamus produces what are called releasing hormones. For example, the TSH releasing hormone or thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin is the same as TSH. So hypothalamus produces a hormone which can release TSH from the anterior pituitary. So the TRH from the hypothalamus is sent to the anterior pituitary. And in the anterior pituitary, its effect is to release the stimulating hormone. In case of the thyroid, it would be the thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. And when the anterior pituitary releases this TSH or the thyroxine or thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland. And then the thyroid gland produces more of its hormone, thyroxine. So you can see that the chain is the TSH releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which in turn makes the pituitary release TSH, and TSH in turn stimulates the thyroid to release thyroxine from the thyroid gland. So that is the chain. So this is sort of, again, simplify things, but at least this chain does operate, and there are a few other chains which operate in a similar fashion. Now you can see how thoughts and feelings come in. Thoughts and feelings converge on the hypothalamus, as we shall see when we go to the nervous system. Hypothalamus is like a funnel where many influences are sort of collecting and then getting funneled, and then from there spreading all over the body to the endocrine system and the nervous system. So hypothalamus is sort of that junction, that coordinating center, where, like, the junctions in the railway stations, where trains from many areas are coming and converging, and then from where a large number of trains then go to many other parts of the country. So here thoughts and feelings and are converging on the hypothalamus. The influence of the feedback coming from the endocrine glands, the target organs, is also converging on the hypothalamus. And all this is being put together to decide how much of TRH should be released, for example, in this case, or any other releasing hormone should be released. Depending upon the amount of releasing hormone released, the activity of the anterior pituitary is affected. And depending upon the activity of the anterior pituitary, the activity of the target gland is affected. So you can see that's how thoughts and feelings can affect a very large number of endocrine glands, just about every endocrine gland. And in fact, you'll gradually sort of, after listening to this again and again, you would feel that thoughts and feelings can affect every function in the body. And that's how thoughts and feelings can keep us healthy, and they can also contribute to our illness in a very significant way. And one thing which you can easily relate to is the menstrual problems. Problems related to the reproductive system, like menstrual problems, are so much influenced by thoughts and feelings because of this type of a chain. I will talk again about it when we go to the reproductive system. Now, looking at all this, we can re-examine the classical statement that pituitary is the master gland. Is pituitary really the master gland? In one way, yes, that was said because the anterior pituitary produces a very large number of hormones like TSH, which in turn influence the activity of a very large number of endocrine glands like the thyroid gland. So anterior pituitary was thought to regulate the activity of many endocrine glands, and therefore it was considered the master gland. But then you can see that the master itself is being controlled by yet another organ, which is a part of the brain, and that the hypothalamus. So in one way, we might say that the true master is actually the hypothalamus and not the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is like that ego, which has this delusion that I control everything. But in fact, hidden behind it is the soul, which manifests as the ego as well as the body, mind, and intellect. So the body, mind, and intellect, you can say, are the target endocrine glands. So it is the uh, ego which is uh, ego which is getting pampered by all the body, mind, and intellect. They work in harmony with each other, and one may restrict one's vision to this. But behind all this uh, is the soul, and so that is sort of the. So one can say that the true master gland is the hypothalamus rather than the anterior pituitary. Now, the next question that arises is that if the hypothalamus has to influence the anterior pituitary, how does it do it? How is it that these releasing hormones are conveyed to the anterior pituitary? These are conveyed through blood because hormones are poured in the blood. So these release hormones, being hormones, are released into the blood which is flowing through the hypothalamus. So the venous blood which leaves the hypothalamus carries with it the releasing hormones which have been released by the hypothalamus. Now, these can travel all over the body, but they don't, because there's a system for releasing them specifically in the anterior pituitary, because the venous blood, the blood in the veins, which leaves the hypothalamus, when it reaches the anterior pituitary, it breaks into another set of capillaries, fine blood vessels across which transfer can take place. So these fine blood vessels then transfer this releasing hormone to the in the anterior pituitary, so that the activity of the anterior pituitary can be affected. So you can see this entire chain, how it is working. The releasing hormones are picked up in the from the hypothalamus by the capillaries which are they are in the hypothalamus. The artery supplying the hypothalamus uh, breaks into a set of capillaries as in every other organ, and it is in the capillaries that the transfer takes place. So in these capillaries, the blood is transferred, so the hormone which is produced here is transferred from the hypothalamus into these capillaries. And these capillaries are carrying it. And if it were not for a special arrangement here, these releasing hormones would travel all over the body, but they don't, because the veins that leave the hypothalamus break into a set of capillaries once more, fine blood vessels across which transfer can easily take place. And that breaking up into a second set of capillaries happens in the anterior pituitary. And that's how this is, the releasing hormones are released in the anterior pituitary, and they can work there. So, this way the action can be localized to the place where it is really needed. Now, this shows you a little more realistically how it happens. This is an artery going to the hypothalamus, and it breaks into a set of capillaries. Any releasing hormones that the hypothalamus has produced enters these capillaries, and then the blood leaves the hypothalamus through these veins. As in any organ, the blood leaves through the veins. But these veins then once again break into a set of capillaries, which doesn't happen everywhere. And most of the places, this is not what happens. But here in the anterior pituitary, there are these veins are breaking up, dividing, branching out into another set of capillaries, so that the releasing hormones which were brought from here are now released into the anterior pituitary and can have an action there. For example, if TRH, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, has been brought from the hypothalamus, that is released into the anterior pituitary, and this thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, will now stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce more of TSH. more of the thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, if there is an anterior pituitary, the question arises, there must be also a posterior pituitary. Anterior is in the front, posterior is behind. And where in fact uh, are these two parts of the pituitary, they are one next to the other. They act like independent organs, but they both have an endocrine function. And we have so far focused only on the anterior pituitary. How about the posterior pituitary? Now, this is the posterior pituitary, and we shall see what it does. But before we do that, how is this entire chain regulated? That is, this chain from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and from the anterior pituitary to the target organ. Say, we have been using the thyroid as a symbol, the chain starting with the TRH from the hypothalamus, affecting the activity of the TSH in the anterior pituitary, and the TSH affecting the activity of the thyroid. How is this chain itself regulated? By negative feedback. You might recollect that negative feedback is called negative because the feedback that is coming leads to a result which is opposite to the type of feedback that has been received. It is negative to the change that has taken place. For example, if the thyroid hormone levels have gone up, then this chain will lead to a reduction in the production of the thyroid hormones. Or if the thyroid hormone levels have gone down, then this chain will lead to an increase in the production of thyroid. So it's negative doesn't mean that the activity always goes down. Negative also means it is opposite to the change, which means if say the thyroid hormone levels have gone down, the negative feedback will lead to an increase, not a decrease, but a positive change in the thyroid. It will lead to an increase in the activity of the thyroid because the feedback is that the thyroid hormone levels have gone down. So that is like the feedback. For example, in an electric iron, if you have set it for a particular temperature, when it crosses that temperature, goes a little higher than that, then the electric iron in fact switches itself off and the temperature starts going down. And when it has gone a little below the level for which it was set, this iron switches itself on again. And the result is it starts going up again. So that is also a negative feedback mechanism. So that is the type of mechanism that operates here also. And this has been shown diagrammatically here. The end result is the hormone or the biological actions of the hormone. In some cases, the biological actions of the hormone itself can also have a feedback effect. For example, insulin is the hormone, and the biological action is reduction or fall in the blood glucose level. Now, the fall in the blood glucose level itself becomes a part of the feedback which is sent to the regulatory system, so that now those mechanisms will come into play which will try to increase the blood sugar. So if the blood sugar has gone down below a certain level as a result of the action of insulin, then those the blood sugar itself, that the biological action of insulin will itself become a part of this feedback, which will ensure that now the insulin secretion is switched off and those hormones are switched on, which can now increase the blood sugar. Or if the blood sugar has increased, as happens after a meal, then the blood sugar level itself will work as a feedback mechanism, which will increase the activity of the pancreas, which will release more insulin, so that now the blood glucose level can be brought down towards more normal levels. That is, not, it doesn't go up as high as it would if there were no insulin. So the biological action itself can be a part of the feedback, but the hormone itself can also be a part of the feedback, as happens, say, in the case of the thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones can feedback, and this hormone may feedback to the hypothalamus or to the anterior pituitary or both. So in different cases, the feedback is at different levels. In some cases, it is only the pituitary. In some cases, it is only the hypothalamus. In some cases, it is both. But to some extent, it would be at both most of the time. So this is the negative effect. That is, the hormone has increase in the hormone levels would have a negative effect. And a decrease in the hormone levels would have a positive effect on these, which is also in a way negative because it's negative to the change that has been fed back. And the result is that the activity of the hypothalamus can be affected, the activity of the anterior pituitary can be affected, which in turn will affect the activity of the target gland. So that is the type of arrangement for influencing the for regulating the activity of this target gland. And the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus in turn are being affected by the thoughts and feelings, because the brain doesn't start here. There's a lot of brain, on top of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is right at the base of the brain. The pituitary also is at the base of the brain. The pituitary and the hypothalamus are close neighbors. But then there's so much of the brain uh, on top of it, which is all influencing through thoughts and feelings the activity of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is actually like a funnel, the way it has been drawn. It is collecting all the information, then funneling it down to the places where activity needs to be regulated, be it in the endocrine system or be it in different parts of the body, like the heart or the lungs or the stomach and the kidneys and so on. So all these activities can be influenced from the hypothalamus. So that's why the hypothalamus is such an important structure, and we'll keep talking about it again and again. So this is the negative feedback mechanism by which the activity of these hormones, the levels of these hormones are affected. Level, when you say level of the hormone, it means the concentration of the hormone in the blood. And that has a rough relationship to the extent to which this hormone will be able to act in the target gland. Why to some extent? Because it will also depend upon whether the target organ has upregulated or downregulated its receptors. So you can see it's a complex system. The feedback is not, the regulation is not only at this level, the regulation is also between the hormone and its biological actions because of the up or down regulation of the receptors in the target organ, which is responsible for the biological actions of the hormone. Now, some of the major hormones of the anterior pituitary are the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which affects the activity of the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands have two parts, the cortex and the medulla. The cortex produces the hormones which are the hormones that go up in, say, chronic stress, where roughly, and we can say, and the medulla, adrenal medulla, produces the hormones which are released in acute stress. Adrenaline, that is released from the adrenal medulla. Adrenal cortex releases cortisol or corticosteroids, or the type of steroids which the doctors use as treatment sometimes. Those belong to this category, and that activity is regulated by the ACTH. And besides these regulatory hormones which affect the activity of the other parts of the body, the anterior pituitary is also the source of growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone, as the name itself suggests, leads to growth, and particularly important in childhood, and released more during sleep while we are awake. And that's why it is said that children grow up while they sleep, which is literally true. And there can be abnormalities in which the growth hormone secretion is not adequate, and that leads to the stunting of the growth. And there are situations in which there is excess of growth hormone, and that can make a person extremely tall. And this then, therefore, means that we may be this may suggest that we can use the growth hormone to stimulate the growth of those who have not grown tall enough. Now, while that appears very tempting, but all stunting of growth may not be due to growth hormone deficiency, and that may not respond to the growth hormone. For example, if the stunting of the growth is due to malnutrition, that may not respond to the growth hormone. The second complication comes in that we may wake up to the fact that the child has not grown enough only when the child is, say, about 15-year-old. Now, by then, in case of girls, menstruation might have started. And in case of boys, the male hormones have started getting secreted. And these male hormones also have some effect on growth. They stimulate growth. And some male hormones are produced also by girls. But then the difference between the action of the growth hormone and the male hormones is that the male hormones not only stimulate growth, they also stimulate the closure of the bone growth. That they at the ends of the bones, what we call the epiphyseal end, that closes, which means that the bones cannot grow any further. So they stimulate the growth as a whole, but then they simultaneously also uh, ensure that the bones after a certain growth will not grow anymore. So if that has happened, then growth hormone will not really be able to help. But however, uh, growth hormone is now available, and if it is used at the right time, may help in the right cases where growth hormone deficiency is making a major contribution to the stunted growth. But then all these qualifications apply. Earlier, very often the male hormones were used for stimulating growth because growth hormone was not available for administration. But then it had this limitation that even if it started early, it may stimulate growth, but then it would also simultaneously soon lead to a stoppage of the further growth of the bones, which means that the person as a whole also will not be able to grow any further. So these are some of the limitations of this approach, but all the same, now growth hormone being available, if it used at the right time, before the child has grown up too much, then if this is making the growth hormone deficiency is making a major contribution to the stunted growth, it can be helpful. Prolactin, prolactin, as the name suggests, has something to do with lactation. And this is a hormone that stimulates milk synthesis, and follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicles of the reproductive organs, both in men and women, although it's called by different names in men and women, and the luteinizing hormone, which also is one of the hormones produced by women. Now we'll talk about prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone when we come to the reproductive system. So these are some of the major hormones of the anterior pituitary. Well, I've already dilated upon the growth hormone. I kept this to remind me that I have to dilate a bit on the growth hormone because we may not talk anymore about it. This excess of growth hormone can take place not only in children who may become very tall, it can also happen in adults. And when it happens in adults, we call it acromegaly. Because then, the person can't grow any further, but then there are at some joints, there is extra growth produced, which and the extremes can grow. At the extremities, there can be a certain growth, and that is why it's called acromegaly. That is enlargement. Megaly is enlargement. Acro is the ends, at the ends of the body, like fingers, etc. So that is that is what's called acromegaly, excess of growth hormone in adults after the growth has been completed. So if there's an anterior pituitary, there should also be a posterior pituitary, and now we should look at the posterior pituitary in some detail. Posterior pituitary, unlike the anterior pituitary, does not produce any hormones. Posterior pituitary is a close neighbor, but it doesn't manufacture hormones. It stores hormones which have been manufactured in the hypothalamus. Once again, we go back to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus has these structures which produce hormones, and these hormones are conveyed by the nerve fibers. All neurons have a fiber which can take a message or a chemical from one place to the other. So the chemicals, that is the hormones which are produced in the hypothalamus, are conveyed by these fibers to the posterior pituitary, released at this end, these endings of the nerves, and the posterior pituitary stores these hormones. But the activity of these hormones is regulated still at the hypothalamic level. How much of the hormone will be synthesized and therefore how much will reach the posterior pituitary is regulated not by the posterior pituitary but by the hypothalamus. So these hormones are once again affected by thoughts and feelings. And the two major hormones of the posterior pituitary, so this arrangement you can see is simple. So we need not dilate too much upon it. This is a simple arrangement as compared to the anterior pituitary, where the hypothalamus brings the releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary and releases it through another set of capillaries here. Here, the nerve cell itself, nerve cells which manufacture these hormones, convey the hormone to the posterior pituitary, and from the posterior pituitary, it will be sent into the bloodstream as from any endocrine organ. The hormones are transferred directly to the blood. So the posterior pituitary will directly transfer these to the blood, from where these hormones can travel all over the body, but they travel all over the body, but will be effective at only those places where the receptors for these hormones exist. This is another picture of the posterior pituitary to show the type of arrangement, these nerve cells in the hypothalamus bring the hormones manufactured there to the posterior pituitary. Once they have been released into the posterior pituitary, the blood that is flowing into the posterior pituitary can pick up these hormones. It will go out in the veins that are leaving the posterior pituitary. This, like any other venous blood, will eventually reach the heart, the right atrium, and from the heart, it will be pumped to the entire body, but then have its effects where the receptors exist. So the hormones of the posterior pituitary are manufactured in the hypothalamus, but are only stored in the posterior pituitary. And the two major hormones of this type are the antidiuretic hormone, which was mentioned also while we were doing the kidneys, and oxytocin. So first let us concentrate on the antidiuretic hormone, or ADGH. Diuresis means producing excessive urine, too much of urine. So antidiuresis is producing less urine. Now, how does the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, reduce the amount of urine formed? By increasing the reabsorption of water. And where will it affect the reabsorption of water? In the region where regulation can take place. Because the absorption that takes place in the early parts of the nephron, that is the cells of the kidneys, is compulsory. That in any case would happen, which means more than 90% of what has been filtered will in any case get reabsorbed. But then the remaining 10% is still a lot, because we actually pass in the urine only 1% or even less than 1% of what was filtered. And how much of it, whether it will be 8%, 9%, or 10%, that will be water that will be taken back, is affected by two major hormones, antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Aldosterone comes from the adrenal cortex, but we'll not go into that. We are concentrating on the posterior pituitary, so we'll focus on the antidiuretic hormone. Now, this antidiuretic hormone increases the reabsorption of water by increasing the extent to which water can be transferred in the uh, distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. That is the towards the end of the nephron, in the last bit of those tubules, which are a part of the cells in the kidneys, that is the nephrons. So that is where the more water is reabsorbed as a result of the action of ADH, and that is how the when ADH levels are high, more water will be reabsorbed, the urine will become concentrated. And then how is the regulation of ADH itself regulated? It is regulated by, again, a set of cells which can sense the saltiness of the body fluids. And this sensitivity lies in the hypothalamus once again. So the close to the place where the antidiuretic hormone is synthesized are cells which are sensitive to the saltiness of the fluid. So you can understand, if the body has lost fluid, say through sweating, because of too much of heat, if water is lost, the fluid will become more concentrated in salt. Its saltiness will go up. This, if from any solution having some salt, you heat the water so that some water is lost, it evaporates when you heat the solution. Now the solution will become more salty because the salt has not gone out, only the water has gone out. Something similar happens, say, in sweating. We are losing much more water than salt, and therefore the body fluids become more salty. And when this type of blood reaches the hypothalamus, because that same blood is going all over the body, the rest of the body is not affected, but the sensitivity to very small changes in this saltiness exists in some cells of the hypothalamus. They'll sense it, and the response of the hypothalamus will be to increase the amount of ADH that it manufactures. If it manufactures more ADH will reach the posterior pituitary. If more ADH reaches the posterior pituitary, more ADH will be released by the posterior pituitary into the blood. And if pituitary releases more ADH will reach the kidneys. And when it reaches the kidneys, it will increase the reabsorption of water. And therefore, the amount of urine produced will go down. So that is how the amount of antidiuretic hormone secreted is regulated. The second hormone of the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. And this again is, many of you may be knowing as the love hormone now. What are the actions of oxytocin in the body? One is it stimulates the contraction of the uterus, and therefore it helps in the delivery of the baby. And a woman who whose labor is not proceeding fast enough, or who has crossed the expected date of delivery by about a week or so, and then there are reasons to try to stimulate the delivery, the process of delivery. And one of the things that the doctors employ is to inject oxytocin. That is because it stimulates the contraction of the uterus. It can help in normal delivery, perhaps, and also helps in inducing labor when the doctor wants to induce it. Uh, it also has a function after the delivery of the baby. It helps in the ejection of milk. The synthesis of milk is affected by other hormones like prolactin. But the ejection of milk, and how is it stimulated? Through a reflex. When the baby suckles the breast, when the baby is put to the breast, then the contact between the child's mouth and the breast, that gives rise to a reflex, which then leads to the ejection of milk. Because that contact between the child and the mother, that stimulates from the hypothalamus the release of oxytocin. So that oxytocin then travels to the posterior pituitary, from where it is released into the blood. When it reaches the breast, it stimulates those muscle cells in those ducts, in those tubes where the milk is. And by making those muscle cells contract in the tubes, it leads to the propulsion of milk, ejection of milk. And that's how this works. Now you can see here again thoughts and feelings come in, because it is not a reflex stimulated purely by the touch, the child's mouth touching its mother's breast. The love that the mother has for the child, and the bond between the child and the mother that was established over the 9 months that the child was in the mother's womb, all that bonding is affecting the release of oxytocin from the hypothalamus. And that bond is further increasing as a result of feeding the child. So the breastfeeding depends upon that bond, and the bond itself is stimulated by the ejection of milk. Now, for a long time, these were the only two functions known. These are the only two functions of oxytocin known, and one wondered then what is oxytocin doing in men? Men don't need these functions. Then it was found it's not just this, it is the feel-good hormone. It's the hormone which affects our thoughts and feelings, or you can say it gives a chemical expression to our thoughts and feelings. Actually, that would be more appropriate, because the thoughts and feelings are not generated as a result of the activity here, but it can be given a chemical expression. And one of the chemical expressions of these feelings, good, is the release of oxytocin. And this is something which can happen both to men and women. They can both feel good. And the two known factors, two known activities, you can say, or two known things which stimulate the release of oxytocin are love and exercise. So exercise can also help us can make us feel good. It's partly by the release of oxytocin, partly by the release of another set of chemicals in the brain, which we call endorphins. But love seems to be the predominant thing that affects the release of oxytocin, and that's why it has come to be known as the love hormone. It can be stimulated by the mere feeling of love, further increased through the expression of love. And the expressions of love can be manifold. And one of the common expressions is touch. So touch can increase the release of oxytocin. So oxytocin is the love hormone. And it has been seen it's not only between the child and its mother, but also couples who get along well, and even when they are just talking, having a loving conversation, oxytocin can be released. It happens only in well-adjusted couples. So it's our thoughts and feelings which affect the release of oxytocin, the love hormone. Suggested reading, again, this popular book, The Human Machine, which has been around for more than 30 years now. And these two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology, and a more comprehensive textbook, Understanding Medical Physiology. Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, the place where I'm speaking from, where I live and work. And if you have any questions, you can, or comments or anything else that you want to tell us, please send an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
I had a question. Um, these days, we see a lot of autoimmune conditions, and um, I, I don't know. A lot of it ties back to the thyroid hormone. Is that a true statement, or it could be many other reasons too for autoimmune condition?
That's again a good question, like all your questions. Autoimmune diseases are essentially a derangement of the immune system. The immune system works on the basis of identification of self as compared to non-self. That is what belongs to the body, self, and what does not belong to the body, which the body does not identify as belonging to itself. That is non-self. So it depends upon this distinction. And the immune system tries to eliminate what does not belong to the body. But then when something goes wrong with this mechanism, it starts treating what belongs to the body also as something foreign. And that may happen in some selected parts of the body. So if it treats, say, the thyroid as not belonging to the body, the immune system may start manufacturing antibodies which work against the thyroid. If it does not identify insulin as belonging to the body, it may start manufacturing antibodies to insulin. So it can happen, and that is a derangement of the immune system. And the immune system is profoundly affected by our thoughts and feelings. And chronic stress is known now, it's well established, leads to a reduction in immunocompetence. Now, reduction in the competence of the immune system can manifest in many ways. Immunity may just become weaker, which increases the possibility of infections and cancer. It may also lead to allergies, which are a hyper expression and excessive expression of the immune system in some conditions. Those are allergies. Or it may lead to the immune system attacking some parts of the body itself. And that is what autoimmunity is. So autoimmunity, again, sort of is closely related to this entire chain. And the effects are starting with the thoughts and feelings, mediated by the brain, particularly the hypothalamus. And the messages are traveling to several hormones as well as the immune system, through that to the immune system. The boundaries are all blurred now. Let's see.
Thank you.
And this blurring of the boundaries gradually leading to a greater and greater recognition of the importance of the mind, what we think and feel, how much it can affect the whole body.
Yes, Soumya ji, please go ahead.
Namaste, Dr. Vichlani.
Namaste.
I want to ask a question. My mother used to be very, very active. Then after my father passed, I think she started becoming lonely. And then, slowly we observed that she developed dementia. Is it something to do with the same really hypothalamus releasing activity, hormone activity?
Well, to some extent, yes, because while I mean dementia is something which is in general affects the elderly. That's why we call it senile dementia. But everybody does not develop it to the same extent, and some hardly seem to be affected by it. That's again because of several factors, you see, because To some extent, it is inherited because we have weak points in the body, which depends upon our genes. But a lot is because of what happens to us in this life, what we did not inherit. And therefore, loneliness or depression could certainly accelerate dementia. Other things which may accelerate dementia are not using enough of the mind, and then to some extent depression comes to the same thing. Sent the mind to some sort of a state of underactivity, some sort of a partial sleep. That's why they say, the dictum in the case of the brain is use it or lose it. If you're using it, it will remain more active. An extreme case of dementia is Alzheimer's, where you have evidence of certain deposits, damaging deposits in a large number of nerve cells in the brain. And since the neurons that are lost do not regenerate, it is thought that whether it's Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia where the neurons have been damaged, nothing much can be done. But again, there's a great deal of optimism which we can have based on some newer findings. The newer findings are that the brain also may not regenerate, although occasionally even regeneration is possible. But even if we assume that the dogma that the brain cells do not regenerate, that is true, even then what it at least means is that there is a great deal of plasticity in the nervous system. That is now a well-established fact, which means that those neurons which have not been affected by this dementia, they can sprout new endings, they can sprout new branches and form new connections so that their reach and their influence can widen. And the result is that the parts which are still active or the neurons which are still working, they can take over some of the functions of the neurons that have been lost. So this sort of rearrangement is possible. And it has been found that this sort of a rearrangement can be stimulated by psychological means. Which means if a person, as you were talking about your mother, who has developed sort of fairly perceptible dementia after being lonely, for feeling lonely and depressed for some time, in such a case, I mean, some of the things, the concrete things which one can do is, if she's fond of certain types of music, let her listen to more of that type of music. If she is more inclined towards religion or spirituality and has been particularly interested in some scripture or some mantras, sort of try and see that she repeats those or those are repeated to her. So anything which sort of she has enjoyed, she finds interesting to do, engage her in that type of activities. Find simple activities in which she can engage in and participate. And that can help dementia. So it's not complete pessimism that it is because of damage to the nerve cells. Nerve cells don't regenerate, so nothing can be done. That sort of pessimism doesn't hold anymore.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat box. Why is there an outburst of acne during puberty? How to regulate hormonal activity and explain this deep integration to teenagers and adults conditioned to symptomatic and immediate relief.
Well, I mean, that is unfortunately true. Acne does increase because of the hormones around puberty, but it can be further accelerated by thoughts and feelings, by the type of lifestyle that the person has, and too much of sort of temptation around without the opportunity to actually satisfy that temptation, which is what happens during youth and in the type of environment which we live. The temptation around is plenty, but the opportunities are not commensurate. And late nights, all these things possibly contribute to further aggravation of the acne. And then certain types of diet, sugar, fat, chocolates, particularly. So these are some of the things which can further increase or aggravate the pimples. How to drive it home to the young people? That is a difficult question. whether to blame the youngsters for it, blame the environment for it, blame the parents for it, for not setting the right example. I mean, these are things which we can just go on discussing, and you can focus on one and forget the other in the meantime. So that can happen in such discussions. But the fact is that, yes, it is a major problem. No teenager likes it because they're very appearance conscious. And the resort generally is to try and apply something local, a cream, which can not do much because of the deeper underlying issues which have not been addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani.
Good morning, Srividya. Any other question, or was this your question?
Yes, this was my question. Thank you. Good morning. Any more questions? All right, if there are no more questions, we close today's session with a moment of silence and meet tomorrow to continue exploring the endocrine system. Thank you, everyone.